will turn age into a competition rather than like ageism or
Definitely.
whatever and knocking people for it.
I like what Paul said,
Absolutely.
that it's a
Making
ranking
us feel
system.
better about ours if we're younger than the number. So there's that too. Thank you all.
Okay, Paul, you're live.
We're live.
You are live.
We're live. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Magical Systems and World Building, presented by Glasgow in 2024. Tonight, we'll be looking into magic, in whatever form it takes, how this influences the world the author creates, and how the different themes we can explore through it. My name is Paul Anthony Short. I am co-head of accessibility for Glasgow 2024. I write fantasy and urban fantasy novels. And I have an incredible panel with me tonight who in a moment I'll ask to introduce themselves and say a little bit about their work. First, some housekeeping. Any webinar attendees can ask questions in the Q&A section. Our tech team will forward those on to us. Are we on YouTube? If we are, please, you can enter questions in the comments. They'll be relayed again for the QA session at the end of this. If you're live tweeting, please use hashtag Glasgow 2024, and then we can pick things up there as well, and also retweet. Please also adhere to the Glasgow 2024 Code of Conduct. That is, we have a zero tolerance policy on racism, anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, homophobia, transphobia, and everything else that makes you the bad guy in a superhero film. Anyone behaving inappropriately will be removed. One strike, no excuses. With that underway, let us start introducing everyone. And I'm going to start counterclockwise from how it appears on my screen. Ronnie.
Okay.
You're
Hi,
first.
everyone. I'm R.R. Verdi. I write predominantly fantasy and urban fantasy. I've been publishing since about 2013. I'm the author of the Grave Report Urban Fantasy series and newly Tales of Tremaine that just came out from Thor and Golanx.
Awesome. Thank you. Rebecca.
Hi everyone, I'm Rebecca Zahabi. I've been writing for a couple of years now, mostly fantasy. Had an urban fantasy and adult novel, and I've just started publishing my trilogy with Glance. So the Collar Bound was out in May this year, and then book 2 is out in May next year.
And JT.
Hello, I'm JT Greathouse. I'm the author of the Pact and Pattern series, the first 2 books of which are behind me on the shelf there, The Hand of the Sun King and The Garden of Empire with Gollancz. Also with Jabberwocky in the United States.
Cool, excellent, thank you. Okay, let's have a look here. So for the purpose of this panel, we're going to be pretty broad about our interpretation of magic. This means we're not just talking about wizards and spells. We mean mutant powers, psychics, Mass Effects biotics, the Force, element bending, every type of special ability that sets a fictional world apart from reality. So even in settings that don't strictly call it magic, we're counting it as magic. And I'd like to kick us off by asking each of our panelists about their own creative process and how your magic systems influence it. For example, in my own books, I tend to create the world and plot alongside my magic systems. So as I develop the magic, I'll adjust the setting. I got flying pirate ships. Okay, I say if ships can fly, you don't rely on sea travel, so ships won't have rounded hulls. They might be flat or have landing struts. So in my Lady Raven series, I was able to make the hero's ship stand out a bit by deciding it was old and from a time before flight had completely taken over. So it still has a rounded hull, so it can go in the sea as well. That meant it was old. Let me give the ship a bit more character and a sense of legacy, and actually fed into one of the climatic scenes in the 3rd novel, where the ship actually does finally go into water. So how do each of you find the process of world building is influenced by your magic, and vice versa? How does the decision of whether magic is openly known or a hidden secret impact this? And we'll start with JT.
Yeah, I mean, it sort of depends on the project. So I'm in the middle of planning a new thing now that I'm about to start writing. And this is turning out very differently from when I was figuring things out for Pact and Pattern. So for Pact and Pattern, I had a very clear idea of the theme of the trilogy, like what I wanted to explore thematically before I had much of anything else. Like I had a character and then I had some some ideas of like big ideas that he was going to have to interact with, to do with like colonialism and power structures and things like that. And so designing the magic system was a way of trying to find a way to like almost make that theme physically real in the story in a way. So the theme was not just something that you would interpret from the interactions of the characters in the setting, but also something the characters would directly interact with by the way that they did magic, if that makes sense. And so it was very much an organic process of like, here's the theme I want to explore. How can I create magic that will reflect that theme in an interesting way that will then also create interesting narrative conflict? Now with the thing I'm working on, the big idea is part and parcel with the way the magic works. And so it's much more like trying to think through it systematically rather than like narratively, if that makes sense. Where the world that I'm building is like being built alongside the magic system in a way where one can't really exist without the other. But also it's not like pact and pattern where the story itself that I was telling and the magic system went hand in hand. It's more like there's a lot of stories that could be told with this magic system. It's just more a part of the world.
Okay, cool. Rebecca?
Yeah, I find I often have ideas for magic systems and ideas for characters, and then I try and find out if they gel together. I think, oh, I wonder how this character would use this magic. I wonder how they would interact with it. And when I find characters and systems that kind of gel, then I start working on the world. So for the Collarbound, I knew I wanted asymmetrical magic. So I have a magic that's all about the mind, which is all about projecting into people's minds. It's a very social magic. Basically, if you can work out what people feel really upset or traumatized about, you can harm them with that. And that was really fun because that allowed for lots of character building. Because then I thought, okay, so my character is really social. What do they, what do they spot in other people? What's the weakness in themselves that can be exploited, etc. And then I created a sort of physical magic that completely closes off the mind magic. You can't do both together. So that was quite fun because then there was imbalance. One could be used against the other couldn't be used against the first one. And then I think the world sort of arises from that. Once I'd sort of created the magical system and knew how my characters were using it, then it was just a question of finding how in the world where there was this kind of magic, they would interact, who would be placed where in the world. Something that I found quite interesting, quite fun in the process was trying to like break the rules of my own system, if that makes sense. So once I'd invented the magical rules, I was like, okay, how do I twist them? How do I cheat? How far can I go? And that was really fun because then it feels really creative and conflictual. We give the rules to the readers and you start finding, workarounds. And hopefully you encourage the readers to try and find workarounds and think about how they would use that magic in this context. So that's how I have fun with it. And of course, the story and the conflict of the story comes in part from that.
Cool. Excellent. That's both of you raised points I want to come back to in a minute or two. Okay, Ronnie, you're up next.
So with me, for Tales of Tremaine, because this was a series all about storytelling and what you believe about people, what you believe about stories, and how belief is tenuous. It changes. Not everybody has all the facts on things. People only ever have their point of view. My magic system, as a necessity, needed to spring out of that because even the god who theoretically created this world has stories about him where he's a character. You have creation myths and they're told in these nesting stories. So magic was a byproduct of the world itself and of creation, and it had to fit in with this line of storytelling itself and that stories are mutable. So my magic system is something between, I guess, hard and soft magic because there are sort of rules of what it tackles. It allows you to interact with what these people believe at time to be their metaphysical principles of the world, how they interact with the world. If you had almost like Hermeticism and its laws, they have their more Asiatic interpretations of those. But because, like I said, storytelling and belief is fluid, it means you can't always count on the magic system to work because it's rooted in your faith, and faith can be broken, it can be changed. You can change your belief, and your belief changes you back. And if you're no longer the same person you once were, how is that going to affect what you can do with your magic, what your magic can do, and what it will do back to you? So my magic system is also extremely dangerous as a result of that because it's fluid. You can't and shouldn't rely on it, and you should be very careful about using it. And part of the story of book one is learning that it has a lot of consequences, both physically and mentally. And maybe you shouldn't be chasing this magic system. And because my protagonist is who he is, he's going to chase it anyways because he is the peak of screw around and find out.
Okay, excellent. That's very, very cool. I love it. So following on then, JT, you brought up themes that you can bring up, and both Rebecca and Ronnie also brought interesting sort of inched onto that as well, sort of thing that magic isn't just, it's not just a tool that you can use, that the characters can use within the setting. It's something that writers can use to broaden what the story is actually about. Like the Force isn't just a cool power you can use. The way you use it and the way it interacts with you tells the story of the character, and it's, you know, their development as they change, what they can do, advances, and how they respond to things will also evolve. So, and I do find that when I'm writing myself, the themes that I want to explore will rise naturally as I figure out the world and how the various things work in it. So whether in your own works or in works you're fans of, what do you think magic allows you to say about the world that you couldn't do without it? How does it change what you can explore?
I'm happy to jump in on that one.
Yeah.
I think one of the big strengths of speculative fiction is magic as a metaphor, is that you can tell people things they already know, maybe logically, but by displacing it into a magical setting, they feel it in a way that maybe isn't as obvious when you're just told. Suddenly, by this roundabout way, by slightly displacing something that we're used to, we understand it completely differently and we see it differently. So magic can really serve as a metaphor in this text to sort of serve the themes of the story. I love what you were saying, Ronnie, about storytelling, because in a way it's kind of meta. Books are about the power of storytelling and how it changes us, and then the magic within the book is about storytelling. So that's a really lovely touch. And there's a lot of stories like that where the magic can, I think, can heighten the themes. But I find that in the creative process it's difficult to know in advance. Sometimes I have the themes in advance and the magic serves it, and sometimes the themes kind of rise from the magic, if that makes sense. You find a really cool idea, you play with it, and then as you're writing it you discover what the story is about. I didn't really go originally for a sort of mind and body dichotomy. I wasn't really interested in that, but then as I wrote it I found the magic system kind of created some of the themes around that, and so some themes around distance, about distance that we can't bridge with other people because we just can't reach them because their magic is so different. And so there was a lot about building bridges and creating connections, which I hadn't necessarily decided beforehand. It arose from the magic system.
Yeah.
Like
Oh, go on, Ronnie.
No, go. Please go ahead.
Okay, fine. So just to jump off of the idea of like, what is something that magic lets you talk about in fiction that you couldn't talk about without it? I'm not sure there is anything, but kind of like what Rebecca is saying, it lets you kind of make things a little bit more obvious than they might be otherwise. So like in the example of Rebecca's book, it sounds like there's this exploration of connections between people and conflicts that can arise from that and things like that. There's tons of like mundane literary fiction that doesn't have magic that is exploring those exact same concepts. But by using a magic system, you can draw attention to it in a way that maybe you can't, or you at least have to do differently in a like without a magic system. And a great example of this that came to mind for me was the X-Men books, right? Which is not like high fantasy, but it is superhero story with a magic system, which is these mutations. And then the story is all about themes of diversity and conflicts that arise in society when you have different types of people interacting with each other. And the question of like, how do you do activism correctly? Like you have Magneto and you have Professor X, who are basically just they're basically like Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X, right? They have two different attitudes, but the same goal, which is to like support their people. And those themes are not like unique to the X-Men. You could write, I mean, there are tons of novels that don't have magic that explore those same ideas, but the X-Men stories like make the differences a little bit more starker and in a way that like draws attention to them differently than it would be if it were set in a more mundane reality.
And I'd like to piggyback off what JT just said, especially with the literary fiction analog he brought up, in that I've always viewed magic systems as a tool, not a definitive. They're supposed to serve a purpose. And with that, you can also see the analog and themes to literary fiction. And a really good example I've taught how magic systems and stakes work in other places has been Rocky, where Rocky, if you want to make the argument, technically has a magic system, but the magic system is character based. And it's the idea of Rocky always going the distance. That was the goal and the promise set in the first movie, to go the distance with Apollo Creed. And it's the theme that's continued all throughout Rocky. He doesn't have to always win. He has to go the distance. And as long as the character does that, he sort of fulfills the promise of being Rocky. And it's why the climax of the first movie has that same almost magical, cathartic appeal. He doesn't win. He loses the fight, but he went the distance. He promised everybody he could do it. And when you put a magic system into that place, like JT was saying, it just allows you to accentuate that a lot more obviously, or maybe in a different way that people may not have picked up on before.
Yeah, excellent. That's a really, really great point. I love bringing Rocky into any conversation. Just to let's hang on to that for a second there. So, what are other ostensibly mundane stories where you could make the argument that there is a form of magic within them? Like, you've given Rocky's actually a great example, because the whole thing is, Rocky does his montage, he does the fight, he loses for the first half of the fight. Like, it's very, Rocky fights are very Saturday morning cartoon battle sort of arrangement. He loses at the start. He has his motivational moment, gets back up, the music swells, and he wins. Was there anything you can think of? I'm not expecting anything major here, because I'm just I'm improvising now. That where you could make that same case where there's magic in the mundane of the world.
Yeah.
Well, I mean,
Hallmark movies. That's the whole. Well, no, it's the whole premise of a Hallmark movie. Not just quite literally the idea, magic of Christmas, but either the romance they promise, the whole, and they're very formulaic, but they work because they still hit those same magical emotional beats people want that resonate with emotions, right? Like magic's whole thing it's a sense of wonder, right? That's what it gives us. But then obviously JT and Rebecca brought up the brilliant points of how thematically it ties into themes and symbols and things we can talk about, like harder aspects of life. And Hallmark does the same, but it just maybe chooses brighter notes of romance and human connection. And as long as it keeps seeding those throughout the movie and then fulfilling it throughout the end, you have that magical feeling of now you're connected with the protagonist who realizes the true meaning of Christmas is leaving his dead end, I don't know, like Wall Street job, and he moves in with this girl in Ireland and they start a cozy cafe together. And that was promised all throughout it. But it makes people feel magical, right? Like that's what magic, if you reduce it down to its core, is supposed to do. It makes you feel magical.
Yeah, and I was going to bring up.
Sorry,
no, you go on.
I was going to say all romance stories kind of clinch on that. A lot of the tension in romance comes from they meet, it looks like they won't end up together for some reason, they're from different worlds, they're star-crossed lovers, the first meeting went terribly, but the promise is they will end up together. So there's a kind of magical force. That's why people like soulmate stories. They're the kind of magical force bringing people together against all odds. So that really is like a magic system. It has rules, from the start that it will apply in a certain way. And sometimes people play with those tropes as well. Sometimes romance stories don't go where we expect. So in a lot of ways, it's quite similar to a fantasy magic system.
Yeah, and I was going to bring up detective stories as another example, where the superpower is just being very intelligent. So like Sherlock Holmes, a Sherlock Holmes story, it's not even told from his point of view because it would be impossible to convincingly write how smart he's supposed to be, which is why Watson exists as a character. And the promise that's being made around the magic system is Sherlock Holmes is smart enough to figure this out. He just needs to get all the information and then he'll be able to put together the pieces and he'll find the solution. And that's basically the formula for every detective story, unless it's doing something wild and subverting the entire genre. But Hercule Poirot, same thing. Once he talks to everybody involved in the whodunit, he figures out, here's the lie that somebody told that unravels the whole thing. And now I know the answer. So it's very much like a magical system in the sense that the superpower at play is the brain of the detective, and the rules of the magic system are they have to gather information. And then once they have enough information, they know what happened, which is not actually how detective work is in the real world at all.
No, it's super hyper competency. That's the magic
Yeah.
system. It's like Jack Reacher. He's 6'19", drinks black coffee, and he never loses a fight, right? Like he's just like a walking slab of 200 pounds of muscle. It's super hyper competent character.
I'll be
Rebecca,
the
you're
Sherlock Holmes complete nerd and just say that there is one short story from Sherlock Holmes' point of view. But you know,
Okay.
this is me being a total nerd here.
okay, excellent. That's awesome stuff. Moving on a little bit now. Now, given that we've now talked about, how magic can be present in more mundane settings and the themes that we do about it, one thing to note is that plenty of stories have fairly clear markers of who can and can't use magic, and that can influence how these people are treated. Mutants are ostracized. Force users, depending on the era of Star Wars you're looking at, are either an elite class or they're hunted. Sherlock Holmes is highly regarded as the world's greatest detective. So what do you think it says about what's the story saying about who gets to use magic and how it can be accessed? Aside from, the obvious answer of they're the protagonists, why is it we see so few settings where magic is something that anyone can just go and learn rather than just something that the chosen few get?
I mean, there's obviously the emotional aspect of the author going into it, right? Like the ability to select who gets magic is definitely a choice of, I don't want to say wish fulfillment, but definitely like some form of casting yourself in the novel, right? Like you get to control. Some people get to feel special. I mean, there's a lot of wish fulfillment that goes into writing, right? Like let's be real. At the end of the day, we're entertainers, and the first people we entertain before we even create this for an audience is ourselves. We're the primary audience, and I think that definitely plays into it. There's always going to be like, if everybody has magic, does magic really feel magical anymore? Then, if everybody has it, at that point, it's just everybody has extra abilities to do the same thing. Where's the sense of wonder and what makes it special? I guess
it depends how you use it, because magic could be a skill. Like everyone can run,
Yeah.
but not everyone's using bolts. So
Yeah.
you could have a democratic magic system in which you follow people who have honed that skill. But you're right. I'm sure there's the element of, as you say, the wish fulfillment element. But I find it really interesting why we don't have more democratic magic systems. Because in the real world, what is it that some people have that other people don't have in terms of magic? What it's going to be like financial power or technological power? I think it's no mistake that sometimes technology becomes a magical element that's controlled by a select few. Because basically magic is about power. So who has power, and whether that means you get to control, or whether that means you're feared and therefore you get to be outcast. I don't know. I think it's just really interesting to think about that in terms of how we think of power structures. Sorry, I sort of interrupted you, Roni. I'll let you finish your point.
No, you're absolutely right. No, that was brilliant. And I think it just goes back to like what you brought up with, if we're talking about who has power and everything, a lot of things authors do is also critique people in systems and power. So if everybody's equal, do we have as much to critique? I guess, because for a lot of people, that's not our daily life, right? Like we all come from different backgrounds, socioeconomically and then racially, that's probably going to end up somehow thematic in our novel anyway, being able to critique something or speaking out against a certain power dynamic or an imbalance in asymmetry or coming from less means, and magic might be a way to show that. It's definitely showing up in my series, Tales of Tremaine, where Ari, and this is obviously going to my South Asian background, is of the lowest possible caste that possibly exists. And he's facing discrimination from that within the education system over there. But then also he's sort of, and this is subtly hinted at, but seeing more discrimination within the school whenever he gets in trouble with magic because of his background. It can be brought up that he's low class, he's not the same quality of caliber as other students. And the magic system then just serves as another tool of, if he screws up, it's infinitely bigger for him because of a different background issue for him. And if everybody has magic, I guess for me, I guess I just say it'd make my life a lot harder to write my series.
But also there's a truth that we don't all have the same amount of power. So therefore, again, magic is a metaphor. By giving magic to some people and not others, you're reflecting sort of the sociological truth that everyone has the same amount of power in the world.
Right. And to kind of connect to what you're saying, Ronnie, in terms of like, it would make it easier for me or harder to write my thing if everybody had magic. I think that's actually the core of it. That's the heart of it, is the reason that we like to like have a control over who has access to magic is because a lot of the times the stories that we want to tell sort of fall apart if everybody can like, you know, heal wounds instantaneously or conjure fire from the air with a snap of their fingers, right? Like if everybody has infinite power to do whatever, there is no tension. And so to create a story that has tension, you have to like sort of cordon off what the magic can do and who can do it and all of those things. And by doing that, you create axes by which narrative can occur. You create tension, right? And so like, this is how I think about creating rules for magic systems in general, whether it's who can do it, what the requirements for doing it are, etc. It's like, how does this create a line in the sand, which now I can't cross and forces me to come up with more interesting narrative solutions than just they snap their fingers and it's magically solved. And actually, like one of the things that I think is true about magic systems is the who can't use it or what can't it do is more interesting than who can use it and what can it do, because that's going to actually like you almost define what the magic is by negative space. So like in my series, a lot of the conflict in the later books comes from the fact that somebody very intentionally shaped this magic system thousands of years ago artificially for reasons. And like that defining the magic by negative space is what he did in order to try and control the destiny of the world in a sense, right? And I think that that's what's most interesting about magic is the negative space around it. If you think about like, sorry, I'm kind of ranting, but if you think about like,
okay, it's good.
Like you know, the very famous Brandon Sanderson laws of magic, what those are is just like systematically defining the negative space of your magic system. Who can use it? What are the rules that define it? Like, what are the costs involved in doing the thing? Like, that's not a positive thing. That's a negative thing. What do you have to give up in order to get something back? And so that's what I think is why magic systems are interesting. So if you have a story where the magic is free to use for everybody, you're losing just a lot of opportunities for interesting storytelling.
It's interesting how often we separate it by people. As opposed to just making the magic a very high price, which then naturally limits it. There are a few magic systems in which the magic tries to like spread. If you think of the Octavia Butler stories, some of them, the magic is a parasite. So it gives you super skills, but what it really wants to do is parasite everyone else and make everyone else sort of non-human. So that's really interesting, because actually then the tension comes from, you kind of want to use the extra skill that's given you. You don't actually want to, you know, give everyone this parasite that will make you non-human. So you could also do it that way, I guess. You could also make a magic system where the price is so high for using it that's what limits users and people using the magic.
Technically what I ended up doing, because I realized magic in my world is something you get to go to school for, but not everyone has the money and ability to go to that school. And then the early high cost, like it can absolutely shatter your mind. And it's kind of like the equivalent of, well, also what kind of job can you get in this world with magic versus other jobs? Because it's a Silk Road empire, so being a trader is more lucrative. So would you rather go into finance class, or would you rather go into maybe being a magician, going schizophrenic, and like it's the equivalent of getting like a liberal arts degree with mental insanity tied on? Like which one's more economically viable right now? Like, so technically everybody can learn magic, but do you really want to? And another thing I realized is there's one other series that did this at the end of its series. And it's a great commentary on this. It was Jim Butcher's Codex of Alera, where certain people are born with the ability to fury craft. But by the end of the series, I mean, the series has been out for a long time, so spoilers, the ability is merit-based. It goes out to the whole world and everybody can learn to do it. It's just no longer concentrated with the ability of, you know, someone being born super powerful. Everybody has to go learn it now by the end of that series.
Like Harry Potter, but they've all got debt because they've all taken on loans to attend the school.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's something that I was just thinking about there as well. About the consequences of using magic, which has been brought up a couple of times now, and just now, of course, as well. One of my personally least favorite tropes or endings to a story is the magic goes away. So the solution to the big bad threat is to end magic. What do you think it can say about the story? What might authors be trying to say if they present this, they give the world this wondrous thing, which then their readers will be attracted to and want to learn about. and it empowers their heroes. What about the choice to say, okay, is this magic a positive thing for for the world? Is it simply a neutral thing that's just a tool that you can just take or leave? Or if they're saying it's something negative that you actually do have to turn away from for the greater good in the end?
Well, I think that sounds to me like a very critique of power, or critique of sort of the way in which power is a problem in the real world as well, right? So, and like here's a comparison I'll make. Like magic is really cool and wonderful, right? Super yachts are also really cool and wonderful, right? I think that they're amazing. Does anybody need a super yacht? No. Does the existence of super yachts siphon a ton of resources that could go to solving actual problems in the world? Yes. So then on balance, is it a good thing for the world that super yachts exist? I mean, they're pretty cool, and the people who get to interact with them get a lot of good out of them. Like in a world where there's magic, and the people who get to interact with it get a lot of good out of it. But if the cost of it is so high that it's causing such like systemic harm that can only be solved by getting rid of it, that's saying something about not just that magical world, but about like how power flows through the real world, and how, you know, money flows through the real world, and resources and things like that, right? So I actually think, like, handled well, I actually love that trope, because if the narrator or the storyteller has set up like why that's happening, why that's the only solution to the problem, it can be really, really like impactful, like a kind of a bittersweet recognition of like, yes, this was amazing, but sometimes there are amazing things that we have to go without for the sake of like solving bigger problems.
For me, I mean, I'd
Maybe that
also
depends on what. Oh, sorry.
Go ahead. They're good.
Good.
Oh, okay. I was going to say we can liken it to social media also, because if we go back to magic systems are a tool, social media allows you to spread and do a lot of positive stuff throughout the world. Twitter, for example, has been fantastic for a lot of LGBTQ and BIPOC authors in terms of reach, connecting with people across the internet, distributors, whatever. But at the same time, the same tool can be used to propagate a lot of hate. And we've seen that, and Twitter's been the primary example of that. And, you know, it's a consequence of like how great it's been for certain communities, and would we be better off without it? Which, I mean, I guess we might find out the answer to the Twitter one pretty soon, depending on how it's going. I'll let you know if we're better off without it. But I would think that that's a great analog for a magic system. Like social media is something we were not prepared for as a species, to be honest. Instantaneous communication, that things go around the world like that, and everybody can chip in with anonymity, complete anonymity, and in many cases removed from consequences of what you could say. We have entire careers now, profiles of people who exist because of social media. They're social media entertainers and influencers, and that's great. And then they also wield power, and they can do terrible things with it, which goes back to what JT said. Like, social media is awesome, but it's also terrible and scary. And the exercise then is, are we better with it because of it or without it?
And to bounce back on both of those points, it depends what the magic stands for. You could have a necromancer story where the magic stands for grief and not letting go of the dead, and then letting go of the magic is sort of moving on. But then you could also have a magic system which is fun, and the author says, but you have to let go of childhood themes and grow up in the end. Even though the magic has helped you, and that I find really annoying in fiction. I find it really annoying when I'm told, you were wrong to invest in this, go and do something adult with your life. I think that's where you're coming from, maybe, Paul. Some stories do that, and it's a bit insulting to the reader's intelligence.
Kind
You
of
spend quite a lot of time investing.
Yeah, of course. If it's a situation where, you know, the magic is damaging to the world, then yeah, it should kind of be gotten, you know, be let go. But to take another example, you've got, for example, Avatar, where bending is powerful. It's treated as it's a martial art. It's treated like a source of discipline and understanding your connection to the world, to the natural world of the setting, and to the spirits. But yeah, you could argue that objectively, an awful lot of problems are caused because of benders. And, you know, there are routes to deal with that. But would removing all bending from that world improve it or lessen it? Especially when you consider how much of their society and their livelihoods is based on the ability to use elements that way. If you take your example, technology is wonderful, but you do get the fact that it also can be very, very damaging to the environment. But as a society, are we better off if we forego all technology and go back to living in, the Stone Age? Is that trade-off worth it? Do we suffer more and die younger as people, etc.? Or can we find a way to balance the two so that we can harmonize? We don't have to get rid of the thing that makes our lives better, but we also don't make it harm the world around us.
I mean, I think kind of like what Rebecca was saying, it comes down to what the magic is a metaphor for, right? So
Absolutely. Yeah.
This trope works well when the author sets it up well. It sets it up to be like, a true dichotomy. You can either have it or not, and these are the consequences of having it, and these are the consequences of not, and now you have to make a choice. It doesn't work as well when like you're reading Chronicles of Narnia and then you kind of get scolded for like enjoying fairy tales a little bit, right? Like that's not the same. It's doing something different, and one I think is an interesting kind of literary device, and the other is just sort of like boring and not saying anything worth saying.
I think there's also something to be said that sometimes you can allow your world to suffer if it means that the audience still gets something to enjoy. Taking example in the Buffy comics, one of the things that they did in the season 8 comic series was they destroyed magic. So, and this was a way to save the world. They destroyed magic. No one can use magic anymore. Although vampires are still a thing, which is odd. But there's no more slayers, for example. That all sorts of happens. So it's kind of like that read to me like just, like you say, taking the thing that made this world fantastic and appealing and saying, the only way this can get better is if we get rid of it. Which, yeah, sure, it would make that world better if there was no monsters or demons or anything running around. But that's also part of why it was appealing to the audience, because those monsters became the metaphor for so many different things. So what does it say? What's the art? What as you say, of course, everything exists because the author has said it is this way. So there's no argument to be had of, oh, but it has to be one way or the other, or this is the way, it's all down to what the story is saying, what the author is saying. What could it say when an author decides that, like you say, with the Chronicles of Narnia, etc., an author's deciding, what are they trying to say when they say, you have to give up the special thing about this world because it's what's best for these characters who are there to, at first bat, entertain you in some way.
Well, it's also running on the assumption that the author knows 100% that that's what's best for an entire world. I mean, we're still people infallible, because just because we like doing something doesn't mean the readers are going to react that way. I mean, there are certainly like TV shows where last few seasons make certain decision choices where they think that's the best choice, and a massive audience of the world will go, nope, that was wrong. We're never going to talk about this show ever again until a new iteration or something comes out. So, that's just obviously going to be the interaction with any art. But as for the author, I guess choosing that's best, that's an opinion, right? Because I mean, there's always going to be craft, but at some point, it's also an opinion. It's your opinion of the craft. It's your opinion of that choice. And we can't remove art from that it's 100% like perfect craft. I mean, you're going to get it wrong as an artist, no matter how big you are too. People might just be less willing to tell you you're wrong if you're really big and famous, because this goes back to the power thing. You can be inured from your consequences. I mean, there's famous stories of authors who've gotten so big and gone, I don't need editors anymore. And and they've gotten away with it. People are like, yeah, you generate X zillions of dollars. You don't need editors anymore. And then fans go like, these books are crap. I don't know. It's one of those, I think it's completely fluid. The author could be trying to say a million things and all of them could be wrong.
But surely, like, good art asks an interesting question, doesn't give an answer. So I think, magic being removed or not being removed in the story, as long as it poses an interesting question for the reader to ponder, it's not really up for us to decide. We create the book, but then the reader creates the discussion afterwards. So I think as long as we start the conversation, that's what matters.
I think it's also like it's possibly talking around the question, but I don't think that this is as much of a problem in stories where the characters in the story itself are the ones who are making the decision around whether or not to get rid of the magic. Again, magic is always metaphorical for something, even if on accident, right? And it feels like when authors are saying, you know, when an author creates a story in which the magic must be gotten rid of, what they're saying is there's something about this that is a problem. And the characters then decide, do we want to accept the problem or do we want to get rid of it? And their answer to that question doesn't have to be the same as the author's answer to that question. It certainly doesn't have to be the same as the reader's answer to that question. Like the point's been raised by Rebecca that art is about like presenting questions, presenting hypotheticals, and then letting the audience kind of play with those. And I think that that's what good literature does. The reason I prefer reading a novel to watching the latest Marvel movie is because the novel might challenge me in some way or make me think about something that the latest Marvel movie probably won't, right? So like what I want from a book is to feel slightly destabilized, slightly unsettled at the end so that I have something to think about. And if the author has done a good job, then the decisions the characters make will cause me to think and cause me to reflect on like, would I do the same thing in that situation? So like, if it's as big of a thing as like, we're going to fundamentally change the structure of our world, we're going to get rid of magic, we're going to like try to find a different way to live, that's saying something enormous, which might be asking the audience to reflect on something enormous, right? And I think, so I'm also like kind of not as interested in literature as entertainment as I think a lot of people are. Like I'm an English teacher. I'm mostly interested in literature as like a vehicle for communication rather than necessarily like what I do just for fun. Video
Why
games
are the curtains
exist.
blue?
Right, exactly. Why are the curtains blue, Ronnie? It's a great question. But like video games
red
exist.
wouldn't match the drapes.
Yeah, movies exist, TV shows exist. There are much easier ways to be entertained if I just want to be entertained. And the thing that literature offers that those things don't is a sort of internality and contemplativeness that I really enjoy and vibe with. And so that's what I'm looking for.
Okay.
I want to bring this back to something that's been built on and sort of circle back to it that you talked about earlier with magic being available to everybody, and then what we're talking about now. And I think something that asks a lot of great questions in relation to this is definitely the TV version of this is the magicians, where technically, because of the POVs we were given, magic is available to everybody, not in the world, but everybody we're introduced to. And as a consequence, they lose magic. So it's not, is magic good in terms of like, oh, we have it and then we lose it, and it's the author commenting on, you know, is this good or bad? It's the opposite, that the real magic of magic was them realizing how magical magic was. Because when they lost it as a consequence, they realized how mundane their lives were and how mundane it was when they had magic. They treated magic so secondhand and as granted, they didn't appreciate how magical their lives were with it. Because in college, they used it to do everything from like making the perfect pot of coffee to, you know, fixing your clothes perfectly and just everyday aspects of life. Magic was normalized for the cast of magicians in their school. And the second they lost it, they realized like, wow, magic was actually magical. It was amazing. It was the greatest thing and we took it for granted. So it sort of tackles a different aspect of that same question and the idea of what happens if everyone has magic anyways. Like, do you even treat it? Do you even care? Or do you take it for granted? And it takes losing it to realize. Okay.
And then losing magic could be like losing ability. It could be, you know, it could be a metaphor for disability or gaining a disability later in life. You could explore really interesting stuff with that. If everyone has a talent that you don't have access to. Someone in the chat mentioned Encanto. That's brilliant. You know, that all your siblings have something that makes them special and you don't.
Mm-hmm.
And that feels very true, you know, as a metaphor. When you're a kid in a big family and you've got lots of siblings, you'll feel they have something special. And you're trying to work out what makes you special. And a lot of kids play with that. They try drawing, they try playing a bit of music, they try finding what makes, you know, what is their thing. So you can also use magic that way, I suppose.
Yeah. I think we've got time for one more question from me before I go to the Q&A. And this is just a really quick thing I wanted to bring up because I think we can agree that the best use of magic in terms of a narrative tool is when it acts as something to aid the hero rather than something to solve their problems. It should either complicate things or simply let them be able to just tackle the problem at all. It shouldn't be the crutch. So what's your favorite moment? Not in something you've written, of a hero either using the magic in a clever, unexpected way that does help them solve the problem, or where magic ends up not being the solution in and of itself, and the hero has to try something else.
For me, it's real cool. It's going to be Dresden Files and Deadbeat, where Harry brings the skeleton dinosaur to life, Sue the T-Rex. I mean, it's absolutely it was really cool. You brought a giant T-Rex to life and you're going through the streets of Chicago on a rampage with a necromantic dinosaur skeleton.
Yep, that was very awesome. Okay.
Mine is just the entirety of A Wizard of Earthsea by Le Guin, in which the magic causes the problem, makes the problem worse over the course of the novel, and then in the end, the solution to the problem is related to the magic, but it's more of just like a self-realization that allows Ged to figure out how to use the magic correctly to solve the problem. And I think that's my prototypical perfect fantasy story about magic.
I think I'd have two. I'd have the headology moments in the Discworld series with Granny Weatherwax, because they're always really smart twists and something we've had all the keys in hand to work it out, and then she just uses it in an unexpected way at the climax. And recently I watched the anime Madoka Magica, which is a magical girl anime, but it's also a horror story.
It's
and when you
very good.
realize the price of magic, and when you realize what a bad deal being a magical girl is, for me, that moment, like in terms of fictional moments, was so good. Because you're told, be a magical girl. And she's like, yeah, sure, I won't even make a wish. I'll be a magical girl. Who doesn't want to be a magical girl? And then you think, actually, no wish is worth it. So it's a really lovely moment, that moment of discovery.
If we count superhero powers as magic too, then My Hero Academia is a fantastic breakdown of that too, especially the problem with the Superman problem and what happens when a kid inherits pretty much the ability to be Superman with consequences.
World of Cardboard speech. Okay, cool. I think, well, I'm going to toss in my one. And if we're counting mundane people as having magic abilities, and appropriate given the recent passing of Kevin Conroy, it's a Batman moment. And it's from Justice League Unlimited, epilogue.
Oh, I know what you're going to say. Yeah, go ahead.
So in this situation, the Ace, this girl that Cadmus has been experimenting on and gave her reality warping mind control powers, has created this fantasy playground for herself, but turns out she is, and no one can get into this place that she's created. She's got this wall of thorns. Amanda Waller shows up and explains to Batman, the Justice League, that Ace is going to have a brain aneurysm. Could be days, could be hours, could be minutes. And if she does it before she turns this off, miles of landscape will be destroyed. People are going to die. And she has to be killed. She has a device which will just shut her brain off, which sounds awful. And Batman says, I'll do it. He takes it. He walks in. He's let in, but he doesn't use it. He just sits down on a swing and he holds her hand and waits for her. No powers, no gadgets, no World's Greatest Detective, just one guy who was being kind. And I think that's huge. And that's probably a magic on its own. And so let's cheer us up a bit. Let's have some questions. I've got one in the Q&A box here from Ed Bell. Sounds like magical themes almost become destiny or fate. How do you give agency to characters if they are bound by the magical themes?
Ooh.
Well, go ahead, Ronnie.
You sure?
Yeah.
Okay. You just have the whole okay.
No, you go first.
All right. I was going to pick the most recent God of War series. The last two games, particularly, if you break them down, are a fantastical breakdown of that, because they also revolve around the magic and idea of prophecy. So magical themes are literally used there to define what's going to happen to these two characters. But all throughout it, you realize it's their free will and their ingrained patterns constantly making those prophecies happen more than anything. And they finally get within the context of that magic system the way to break that, which is none of this is prophecy. It's you guys are just so set in your ways that everything you do has become this predictable. And the biggest thing you can do is change. And in the very first game of the new iteration of the series, there's a moment where Kratos tells his son to shut himself out to the pain and all the things of the world when he's over this wounded deer that he shot. And he's still speaking like this general from Sparta, like, don't listen to pain, don't listen to hurt, to trauma. And by the end of it, he comes full circle telling his son one of the biggest ways to change is you need to open your heart to all that pain, because that's actually who you are. You're a very empathetic person. I'm very different from you. And by doing this, you can become the god you're meant to do. And that moment near the end of the second game is what changes their destiny and their fate. And it was literally supposed to be set up that way, but it was also established that it's only set this way because you people keep choosing to do it. And the second you make a different choice, then you can change all of that. And that choice was seeded in the first game to the very end, and they come back to it, and it's beautifully done.
So yeah, that's a great example. And I was actually God of War came to mind for me as well.
Okay.
But the other thing that I was going to talk about is I have a student right now who is doing his like senior honors project on this topic, on literature of fate and destiny. And what he's doing is he's comparing and contrasting the way that fate and destiny is depicted in Macbeth versus Berserk by Kentaro Miura.
Oh God.
So these are two stories which both prominently featured fate and destiny as a theme, right? Like in one, the Macbeth is promised that he will be king, it's prophesied, and then that prophecy is what actually drives him to start making the decisions that lead to his eventual downfall, right? And so the theme there is like when you're told that you have a specific fate and you decide to follow it, that can have disastrous consequences for you. And then on the opposite end, in Berserk, you have the main character Guts, who is sort of branded to be a sacrifice to demons. And he spends the rest of his life fighting against that inevitable destiny, like to the point of quite profound violence and suffering. But the point of the story is like, there is no such thing as fate. You can always fight against your circumstances. You can always struggle. Even if somebody tells you something is inevitable, you can try to like push against it, right? So it's sort of like giving into what you've been told is your destiny versus refusing to accept it and struggling. And like, the thing about it is fate, when you treat it seriously and when you treat it the way that people who actually believed in it, like the ancient Greeks treated it, it wasn't something that was just like accepted. You didn't just like lay down and accept your fate. Many, many, many ancient Greek stories are about struggling against fate. Many, many stories from cultures that actually believe in this concept are about that. And so it gives you an interesting like thing to play with is are we determined? Are we destined to do certain things? Do we have free will and control or not? But the reality is that even when you don't have free will and control, you still feel like you do. And so it still feels like you're making decisions and doing things. And exploring that tension can be really fascinating. And there's like a huge body of literature that does that.
Yeah, I love how you left out all the just horrible trauma, both that Guts faces by going against fate, and also the Greek stories. Yeah, you can go against fate. Just know you are signing up for like an eternity of therapy. If you
it's
do.
Not easy to go against fate, but it's possible. Is kind of the
possible.
point,
yeah,
right. Yeah.
Or it's not possible, but the fun comes from resisting it, and then how are they actually going to fulfill their fate? As you say, a lot of Greek tragedies,
like Oedipus Rex.
Exactly. Yeah. That's the first thing that came to mind. And there's a few Icelandic sagas of Vikings being told, you'll die next to a horse's head or something. So they're like, okay, I won't engage with horses, my whole life. And of course, the last day of their life on this island, and they see, a carcass of a horse, and they're like, oh, spent my whole life avoiding this moment. It's happened. Yeah. I think as long as there's conflict, basically, you've got a story. So as long as either the magic is going one way and the protagonist is going the other way, or the magic is really difficult to follow, even though the protagonist is trying to, follow his fate or their fate and prophecy, but can't actually follow it. They're lacking information. They follow it wrong. As long as you've got some conflict in there, I think you can make the story work.
For sure.
We have a question also here from Rob and Julie. What sci-fi and fantasy novels do you feel have the best worked out systems of magic? That's a big one.
This is
they didn't say other than yours, so I'm going to say mine.
That's cheeky.
Wow.
That is entirely fair.
Damn. Um,
Octavia Butler's Xenogenesis. It is technically science fiction, but it's so well done. And it's really thought through. It's all about genetics, basically. It's all about aliens and genetics, and these aliens who need to reproduce with another species in their own systematically. So they sort of travel the universe finding other species to reproduce with. And that's really, really well done. Someone in the chat also mentioned the 5th season. And in terms of how magic influences world building and world building influences magic, that's really fun because humans have evolved with really big scale power in a world that regularly has apocalypses. And that's really interesting because on the one hand, that's how humans survive it. On the other hand, humans can actually provoke apocalypses, which obviously is problematic. So that I'd quote those two authors as really good magic system.
Yeah, the 5th season's a really good pick for this.
Mhm.
It's incredibly well thought out and clear what's happening when they're using magic, but then also the ramifications of the existence of the magic system are extremely well thought out and clear. So that's a great one.
I spent the book kind of wondering, did humans evolve the capacity to survive like big tectonic shifts so they wouldn't die in this world that keeps having them? Or is it because humans have the power to do it that the world's so unstable? That keeps,
Good question.
You know what I mean? It's really well done.
Yeah.
Mine, I'm probably gonna get in trouble for this because it's also a really old book, and what I'm gonna say following it, but it's Master of the Five Magics by Lyndon B. Hardy, which first came out in 1980, and it's one of the earliest examples of a codified hard magic system. Today, it's not going to seem very unique to a lot of people, but it was one of the forerunners that like helped set up a lot of foundations that some of the biggest names today use. Like it had 5 magic systems, obviously for the first name, and I believe they were wizardry, but then it went into a rules of like how wizardry works. Like there's the law of ubiquity and then the law of dichotomy of how by doing certain things, you have a cost and consequence. And then there was sorcery, the ability to control minds. But again, there were certain doctrines of how that worked, and it was very hard and codified. And then they had thaumaturgy, which is the earliest use of sympathy that's come and been used by a lot of other authors later. And if you dial back how sympathy works, it's really voodoo. It's the practice of how you can link two bodies through their principle of similarity and contagion. And a lot of magic systems from Master of the Five Magics have shown up today in really popular novels and been re-evolved, and even anime has sort of evolved from that. And it was just one of the first ones to do that. I think it was really cool coming across that because I found it in the 90s as a kid from a like a yard sale thing. And back then in the 90s, magic was very numinous. You know, this was Dragonlance, this was Forgotten Realms. It was very high magic fantasy times. And someone else went like, I'm going to put rules to magic and I'm going to make magical systems. And when you go back, you can see the other cultures he drew those rules from. Every one of those magic systems actually has a mythological component to different cultures. A lot of them being from the East of what set those magic systems up. And I thought that was really fascinating.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Oh,
sorry. I actually have a serious answer. I was joking earlier.
Okay.
But I think Robin Hobb's Realms of the Elderlings books have a really good magic system. It's not quite as like flashy as many. It's mostly just different types of like psychic interaction, whether with animals or with other people. But some of the ways that she explores like how this society views the two different magic systems, like the one that involves animals is perceived as a little bit spookier and like witchcrafty. Meanwhile, the like king uses the other one, and the fact that he's able to like is part of why he's the king and stuff like that. And I think that that's really cool, and also like a good example of a magic system that does have clear rules, but they're not spelled out for you like super clearly, because in the world of the stories, there aren't like codified rules about how this works. It's just sort of a thing that's passed from one person to the next who's able to figure it out. And so it's like you know that there are rules, but they're not. It's not like you ever read a passage where somebody says like, oh, and then I have to like sacrifice a goat and that produces this much energy, which I can use to conjure a fireball or whatever.
Okay.
It's interesting talking about power, just to jump in on what you said, that Robin Hood's system, as you say, you have a magic that's an elite magic and magic that's an outcast magic.
Mm-hmm.
And they're actually eerily similar as you work through the books. You're like, actually, they might stem from the same stuff. But one's all to do with animals, and therefore it's, dirty. And one's all to do with human minds, and so therefore that's art.
Mm-hmm.
And then she sort of brings them close together through the books, which I think is really smartly done.
Cool. Question from Alexandra. What do you think is the difference between the kind of satisfying hypercompetence you described vis-a-vis Sherlock Holmes or Poirot and a Mary Sue?
Well, I don't like the term Mary Sue.
I know, neither do I personally. It's like it's
off the top. Like, I think that that's a thing that we say when we mean I don't like that protagonist, or that protagonist wasn't written very well.
Yeah.
And it's I think that really what it is it's just like, if a character doesn't feel real to you, or they don't feel like they're grounded, they just seem like they have a nonsensical capacity for success or whatever, then they feel like a Mary Sue. But that just comes down to like, how well did the author establish their humanity and establish their conflicts and things like that. You can have like like, frankly, Luke Skywalker is a Mary Sue in a lot of ways. He follows most of the Mary Sue archetypes, but we like him because he's pretty well written, and like we get to know him before he gets powerful. And that's why once he becomes very powerful, we don't react to him the way that we react to like a character from a bad fan fiction who has all the superpowers on paragraph 1.
Yeah,
I'd say it's two things, the Mary Sue. One, has your character got flaws? If you think Sherlock Holmes, he's super smart, and then his emotional intelligence is down the drain. You know,
and a cocaine addict.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And he does drugs, and he's obviously not okay. So if a character has flaws, then it's fine. And it comes back to what we were saying about magic being able to wave away conflict and problems. If we feel the character has no real problems because they're so powerful they could just solve them, then you haven't really got a story, or you've only got a story because it feels like the character's not just, doing their job and getting it done, sorted. You see what I mean? If they can solve the problem, if they put their minds to it and then don't do it, they become really annoying because they have all this power and they're not using it in a pertinent way. Whereas if for some reason their power is not suited to the solution, then, or they have flaws that mean that they can actually deal with the situation, then you've got conflict, then you've got a story. So I think it's really just about that. It's about making sure that your character hasn't got the solution to the story and doesn't use it for no reasons.
Yeah, and then also the consequences you bring up for that level of hypercompetency, because some people would argue Batman's a Mary Sue, but a lot of people don't, because first of all, his whole character arc's established first by his trauma. We already know he's wounded before he becomes the Batman and is this terrifying force who's extremely well prepared for everything. But his moral code, which is also being part of Batman and part of his superpower that he can defeat everybody without killing them, comes back to have consequences when some of his rogues galleries, kill members of his family or kill members of Gotham. And then it becomes this constant question, why aren't you stopping them for good? Which is what happens in the Injustice arc, where the Joker kills pregnant Lois Lane and Superman's possible baby. And then Superman goes rogue because he's like, you could have stopped this all these times and you didn't, so now I will. Or obviously the most famous one, Death in the Family, with the death of Jason Todd, who comes back like, you didn't stop him like from killing all these people that we love, including me. Like, you could have. But because you chose to be the perfect Batman, there are consequences to that, which removes him from being, I guess, a Marty Stu, because he's not removed from the consequences of his perfection or perceived perfection.
Yeah, no, and it really just comes down to like you're saying, does the character make mistakes? Does the character have to deal with actual problems that are not trivial for them to overcome? And like Superman, talk about a character who's way overpowered and way too likable and basically flawless in a lot of incarnations. Why isn't he usually described as a Gary Stu or whatever? It's because like part of what we like about him is that he's like representative of an ideal of goodness, and his stories are often exploring like, what are the ramifications of being that good, right? How do you actually navigate the world when you are like trying to be morally perfect and also can do anything? So yeah, like it's just finding where's the tension, where's the possible conflict in this character and exploring it.
Okay.
I'm going to be really annoying and put my feminist hat on 2 minutes. I think also Mary Sue's tend to be female characters written by women in fan fiction and tend to get trashed for that reason, and characters who correspond to the same tropes for male, but Gary Stu's tend to not get as much backlash.
Yeah,
that's definitely the case.
Right.
Oh no, absolutely.
Yeah,
the fact
absolutely.
is, if Ray had been written as a male character, no one would have had a problem with her at all.
She's not meaningfully different from Luke Skywalker. Like,
no, she's not. She's basically the same character, and that's part of the point of her. So yeah, we have a question from John. Have touched on already, but Mary Robinette Cowell considers science and magic one of the same in fiction. She had a great argument about it with Adrian Tchaikovsky at EasterCon earlier this year. Do you agree with Mary Robinette, and are there exceptions? I
Or
kind of
also-
feel like we address this at the very start, and that we were accepting that, you know, science and magic are the same. I mean, even the event blurb of our event quotes Thor from his first movie, that they are one and the same. For the purposes of fiction, they are the thing that sets the universe apart from reality.
Also, Scott Carter's got a really nice definition of science fiction and fantasy. He said, if you do magic by clicking on a button, it's science fiction. And if you do magic by rubbing an amulet or touching a tree, it's fantasy. Which is, you know, a simplistic definition, but it kind of works.
Yeah. And I think that
Well-
line gets blurrier and blurrier the more hard magic systems kind of take over the space, right? Like I do really think that a hard magic system and a well-written science fiction world there's very little meaningfully different about them from like a narrative perspective. From a sort of tone or aesthetic perspective, there's a difference. Like a wizard is aesthetically distinct from a guy in a jumpsuit, but from a narrative perspective, they're doing similar things narratively.
There's I find there's more. Sorry, go on.
Oh, I was going to say it also depends on, I guess, how either of those things are viewed in that world, because then you have things like Gene Wolfe's Book of the New Sun, where there's a lot of things that are now being interpreted as things like magic, because that's just the worldview, because you've lost either time of history, or you've lost a certain perception or the knowledge of how certain technology works. So if you can't perceive technology, even if you have access to it as technology, and you lose the science that makes it work, is it magic even when it's technology to us? Like if you don't know how a lightsaber works and you hand it to someone who has no understanding what it is, isn't that piece of technology still magic? So it also goes back to the framing of you, not necessarily how well it's defined. It's the perception of who is in possession of that or interacting with that. And then that's the narrative tool you get to use, because you can withhold that information or that understanding or that even sense of norm from either the readers or the characters. And you could have, I mean, you could easily do a dialogue of a novel with two different societies interacting with the same thing. And to one, it's magic, and to the other, it's technology.
Right.
And who's actually right, to be honest.
Yeah. And I would throw out that until the extended universe authors explained to us how lightsabers worked, they were magic.
Yes. Yeah.
Fair.
And I mean, the Force did that. In the first movies, it was space magic. In the second, it was midichlorians. And I was like, that was a big fundamental. Like
he said, can we kick him? He said the forbidden word.
He said the M word.
Well, I'm on your side. I'm not a fan of them, but
no, you're right. Like for example, in the Warhammer 40k universe, for example, they have priests who pray to computers to get them to work. This is not
and the orcs
explicitly the orcs. Their technology works because of their psychic powers.
Because it works.
Because it works. They believe it works.
Gestalt consciousness, right?
Yeah, I do find that in science fiction, though, there is more of a one of the other differences between science fiction, and fantasy is in science fiction you tend to see a lot more expectation that it'll be explained to the reader how it works. You know,
but that is also
you need to know what the magical exception the magical exception is.
Yeah, but that is also how hard magic systems work. Like the expectation, if you're reading a book with a very hard magic system, is by the end of this series, I will understand how this magic works on a fundamental level. So that's why I say,
what I mean is like
hard magic and sci-fi are the same thing.
they're so
switch, isn't it? On one end of the dimmer switch, there's we will explain everything, and on the other end, there's magical realism, and you'll just go with this, you know, and you can be anywhere in the middle, and that's a narrative choice from the author, I think.
Exactly. And so there are no more genres. It's all the same.
Genres are just marketing categories.
Genre.
That's the big secret. Like as somebody who still works part-time in a bookstore, they're just marketing categories. That's all they are.
But very hard, even science fiction systems can read as magic. I don't know if you've read The Three Body Problem.
Yeah.
Book 3 of the Three Body Problem series.
Pretty weird.
My quantum physics are not high enough. To me, it was
Pretty
magic.
weird.
Space was being folded. I was like, well, maybe it's mathematically possible. But to my understanding, it's magic.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, I'd argue that Star Trek is as much space opera as Star Wars is. You know, it's as much fantasy because, you know, Q is magic. You know, antimatter replicators are basically magic. I don't think we have any more questions. Doesn't look like it now. I'll give a couple more minutes while I just prep some, look at my notes here to see the information. No, no more questions. Okay. All right. So first up, just some housekeeping then for Glasgow 2024. We have upcoming events. Thursday, the 8th of December at 7 p.m. We will have a Wheel of Time fandom roundtable. On Tuesday, the 20th of December at 7 p.m. we have Always Winter and Never Christmas, to their special Christmas event. And then early in the new year, on January 18th, Wednesday, 7 p.m., we have our panel on neurodiversity in science fiction and fantasy. So if you enjoyed this event, please consider volunteering for Glasgow 2024. We're always looking for people to help out. And to close us out, I'm going to ask everyone to just tell us where we can find you and your work and more about you. I'll kick off. I'm Paul Anthony Short again. My website is paulanthonyshort.com, where you can see my books, the Memory Wars trilogy and the Lady Raven series. And I'm also on Twitter at PA Short with 2 T's. And I'm on Facebook. And also moving on to things like Hive and Mastodon because of, the Musk fire that we have. So then, back in the initial order that I started us in, Ronnie, can you tell us where to find more about you?
Yeah, Facebook might be the best place right now because of what you just said. It'll just be Facebook/RRVerdi. Obviously, Twitter is where I'm most active, and we'll see how long that lasts. I might be posting a Discord link because I just created a fan Discord, which has been popping off, and a lot of people have been liking that. So I'll be sharing that on my Twitter, which is just at RRVerdi. And then my books are available wherever books are sold.
Cool. Rebecca?
Yeah, I'm not on social media, so you have to go the old-fashioned way and go on my website, which is just my name.com, rebeccazahavi.com. I have got a newsletter though. This is my concession to social media. So if you want to hear me rant about stories and books and tropes, that's the place to go.
Excellent. And JT?
I'm on most social medias as either at Jeremy TEG or I'm on Facebook, I think, as JT Greathouse Author. And then my website is jtgreathouse.com. Yeah, I mean, we'll see how long I'm on Twitter. That's usually where I actually do things.
Excellent.
It'd be like that.
It do be like that.
It do be like that. Okay, so all right, this has been Glasgow 2024 Presents Worldbuilding and Magical Systems. I want to thank all of our panelists, all of our attendees, and our great questions. Thanks to John for our tech team there for keeping us running. And I hope to see you all again in the future.
Thank you so much.
Bye.
And thank you for
Thank
sharing
you.
and doing all the hard work.
Yeah.
And just a few seconds more to Brad.